Barry Harris is a living legend and the greatest jazz educator on the planet. My name is Bill Graham, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Barry's ideas about bebop improvisation. The two concepts we're going to be talking about today completely transformed my playing overnight. We're going to be talking about his concept for adding extra half steps to descending scale lines, and his concept of the family of four dominants. Let's get right to it. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is what Barry calls a dominant seventh scale. So let's say we were in the key of F major. Well, the 5 chord in the key of F is a C7, right? So if we play in the key of F, just starting and ending on a C, we get what Barry calls a C dominant seventh scale. You could also look at it as a major scale with a lowered 7th degree. If you're a more modally oriented thinker, you'll probably want to call that a Mixolydian scale. So let's talk about Barry's extra half-step rules for descending lines. Rule number 1 is if you start on the root, 3rd, 5th, or 7th of the chord, you can put an extra half step in between the root and the 7th. So let's say we're on C7, and instead of just coming straight down the scale, we're going to put an extra half step in between the root and the 7th. And when we do that, we end up with a chord tone on every strong beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. We've got the root, then the 7th, the 5th, the 3rd, and then the root again. Okay, we can do that from the 3rd. Or from the 5th. Or from the 7th. Rule number 2 is that if you start on the 2nd, 4th, or 6th, you add no half steps. Starting from the 4th, and starting from the 6th. Or you can add 2 half steps between the 2nd and the root, and then between the root and the 7th. Rule number 3 is that if you start on the 3rd, 5th, or 7th of the chord, you can add 3 half steps between the 3rd and 2nd, 2nd and root and 7th. So if we start on the 3rd, or starting from the 5th, or starting from the 7th. So let's practice all of those, starting with rule 1 from the root. 2, a 1, 2, 3. From the 3rd, from the 5th, from the 7th, rule 2 from the 2nd, from the 4th, from the 6th, from the 2nd with extra half steps, from the 4th, from the 6th. Okay, here's rule 3 with extra half steps from the 3rd. 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. From the 5th, and from the 7th. Let's try that whole sequence on F7. 2, a 1, 2, 3. Extras. Go around the circle of fifths and practice that in every key. So let's stay on F7 for a minute and talk about the 4 arpeggios that Barry shows us are inside of the F7 chord and F7 scale. So obviously there's an F7 arpeggio, and then there's also an arpeggio that starts on the 3rd of the chord. Now that looks like an A minor 7 flat 5, right? And so when you see an A minor 7 flat 5 chord, you can actually think F7 over it. But you can also play this arpeggio over an F7 chord. Next, if we go up and start an arpeggio from the 5th, we get what looks like a C minor 7 chord, and it is. So Barry shows us that when you're playing a 2-5, just think 5. So when you're on C minor 7, just think F7. Okay? And lastly, there's an arpeggio on the 7th, which is E flat major 7. So now let's play each of these arpeggios into a descending scale line using the rules. So let's start with an F7 arpeggio. And if we resolve down from there, we end up on the 6th degree of the scale. So we're going to apply rule number 2, which is no half steps. Or we could apply the other version of rule 2, which is 2 half steps between 2 and 1 and 1 and 7. What if we resolve the arpeggio up? Okay, well now we're on the root, so let's apply rule number 1. Cool. What if we resolve the arpeggio up another 3rd? So what if we said, now we're on the 2nd, so we're going to apply rule 2 again. Or the other version of rule 2. Great. Okay, how about if we start our arpeggio from the 3rd? Well, if we resolve it down, we're back on the root, so we're going to apply rule 1. Okay. If we resolve it up, now we're on the 3rd of the chord, so we could apply rule 1. Or rule 3, which is a half step between 3 and 2, 2 and 1, and 1 and 7. And if we resolved it up another step, now we're on the 4th, so we're going to apply rule 2, or the other version of rule 2. Great. Let's try an arpeggio from the 5th of the chord, which if we resolve down, we end up on the 3rd. So we're going to apply rule number 1. Or we could apply rule number 3. How about if we resolve up a step? Well, now we're on the 5th of the chord, so we can apply those same 2 rules. Or, and what about if we resolved up another step from there? Well, now we're on the 6th of the chord, so we're going to use rule 2. Or the other version of rule 2. And lastly, how about an arpeggio from the 7th of the chord? So if we resolve down, we end up at the 5th, and so we're going to apply rule number 1. Or rule number 3. Okay, if we resolve it up a step, then we're on the 7th of the chord, so we've got the exact same 2 rules to apply. Or, And if we resolve it up another step, then we're on the root, so we have to use rule 1. All right, let's try all of those combinations in a row. 2, a 1, 2, 3. Let's try all those combinations in B flat now. 2, a 1, 2, 3. So those are Barry's models for adding extra half steps to descending dominant 7th scales. If you've spent any time at all checking out the playing of bebop masters like Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, or Barry himself, you should already be recognizing some of these sounds from their solos. The next concept we're going to talk about is what really changed my playing forever. This is what Barry refers to as the family of 4 dominants. So the concept of the family of 4 dominants revolves around the diminished 7th chord. So let's take a B diminished 7th chord, for example. The notes in a B diminished 7th chord are B, D, F, and A flat. So if you take any one of these 4 notes and drop it by a half step, you get a dominant 7th chord. Let's start by dropping the B to a B flat. And now we have a B flat 7 chord. Let's move it back. Now let's move the next note, D, down a half step. Now we have a D flat 7th chord. Let's move it back. The next note, F, let's move that down a half step to E, and now we have an E7 chord. Let's move it back. And finally move the last note, A flat, down a half step to G, and now that is a G7th chord. So this B diminished chord gave us B flat 7, D flat 7, E7, and G7. Let's take a look at the roots of those chords. B flat, D flat, E, and G. Well, those form another diminished 7th chord that's a half step away from the first diminished 7th chord, right? So you could look at that as forming a diminished scale. So because those 4 dominant chords are related together through that diminished chord, Barry calls them a family and shows us how we can substitute them for one another or superimpose them over one another as chord voicings, arpeggios, or full-scale lines. So let's go back to our diminished chord and build those 4 dominants and see how they relate to one another in a key. So let's go the other way. So let's take the top note and drop it down, and that gives us G7. So G7 is the 5 chord in the key of C. If we go back to our B diminished and drop the next note down, we get an E7, which is the 5 chord in the relative minor of C, which is A minor. Let's go back to our diminished chord and drop the next note down. So now D flat 7 is the tritone substitution for G7. So that means it's the tritone substitution for the 5 chord in the key of C. And then lastly, if we drop our lowest note, we get a B flat 7. Now B flat 7 is the backdoor dominant chord, or the flat 7 dominant chord in the key of C, and it's also the tritone substitution for the 5 chord in the relative minor, A minor. Another way I like to look at that backdoor dominant chord is as the 5 chord in the relative major of the parallel minor, right? So we're in C major. The parallel minor of C major is C minor. The relative major of C minor is E flat major. And the dominant chord, the 5 chord in the key of E flat major, is B flat 7. So that's how B flat 7 is related to the key of C major. Let's try superimposing all of those chords from the family over a G7 shell. So if we start with a G7, that's just a plain unaltered G7 chord. Let's go to the next member of the family, which is a B flat 7. Now what that gives us is a G7 with a sharp 9 and a flat 9. How about a D flat 7 over G7? So this gives us a G7 with a flat 5 and a flat 9. And the next chord up is E7. So to play E7 over G7, we end up with a 13 and a flat 9. So this is a G13 flat 9. And we can, of course, also just play the B diminished chord over our G7. And that gives us a G7 flat 9. Let's try putting this in the context of a 2-5-1. So Barry tells us that on a 2-5-1, we should just think the 5 chord going to the 1. Or we can think the 5 chord over the 2, and then when we get to the 5 chord, you can go to one of the other chords from the family of 4 dominants. Barry calls this playing with your brothers and sisters. So let's start by over D minor 7, G7, C major 7. We're going to think G7 over both D minor 7 and G7, and then we're going to resolve into a chord tone of C. 2, 1, 2, 3. So what were we thinking there? Over the 2 chord, D minor 7, we're thinking G7. We're thinking an arpeggio on the 5th of G7, and that resolves down to the 3rd. So we're going to use our rule where we can put a half step between 3 and 2, 2 and 1, and 1 and 7, and then we continue down the scale until we resolve into the 5th of the 1 chord. So let's play that slowly. And back up at tempo. 2, 1, 2, 3. Good. Let's try another one. This time we're going to come up from the 7th of a G7 chord. And we applied the exact same rule. So we put a half step between 3 and 2, between 2 and 1, and between 1 and 7. Slowly. And we ended on the 7th of the 1 chord this time. Let's try that again at tempo. 2, 1, 2, 3. Let's try using one of the siblings over the 5 chord. So now we're still going to think G7 over the 2 chord, but when we get to the 5 chord, let's think D flat 7. So over D minor 7, we're thinking G7. But now on G7, let's think D flat 7. So this note right here, B flat, that we landed on, is the 6th of a D flat 7 scale. So we're going to use the rule where we add a half step between 2 and 1 and a half step between 1 and 7. And then we end on the 7th of the 1 chord. So that's a great sound that you would never come up with using chord scale theory. Let's try it up to tempo. 2, 1, 2, 3. And slow one more time. 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. Let's try thinking B flat 7 over G7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we played up a G7 arpeggio from the 7th, and then we got up to the root, so we used our rule to add a half step between 1 and 7, and then when we got to our G7, we landed on a D natural. So that's the 5th of G7, but it's also the 3rd of B flat 7. So we came down our B flat 7 scale and used our rule to put a half step between 1 and 7. And then we resolved up into the 3rd of the 1 chord. Again, combinations that you would never come up with chord scale theory, but that you've heard a million times on Charlie Parker and Bud Powell solos. Let's try playing E7 over the 5 chord now. So we're still going to think G7 over the 2. But now when we get to G7, we're going to think E7. So this D, which is the 5th of G7, is also the 7th of E7. So we're going to continue down an E7 scale, and then use our rule to put a half step between 3 and 2, and 2 and 1, and then when we get to the 1, it's actually the 3rd of the 1 chord. So one more time slowly. And up to tempo. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now let's try running a couple of these siblings into one another. We're still going to think G7 over the 2 chord, but now over the 5 chord, we're going to try thinking B flat 7 to D flat 7. 2, 3, 4. So let's slow that down. We go up an arpeggio on the 5th of the 5 chord, and then we get to G7, and we come down a B flat 7 arpeggio, and then we start coming down a D flat 7 arpeggio, and instead of continuing down, we pivot up an octave, and then continue down, and then we resolved into our 1 chord. Back up to tempo. 2, 3, 4. Let's try another 2. So we're still going to think G7 over the 2 chord, but this time we're going to think E7 to D flat 7 over the 5 chord. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. So what we're thinking there is over the 2 chord, we're thinking an arpeggio up from the 7th of G7, and then walk down our G7 scale. But as soon as we get to G7, we're going to play down an inversion of E7, And then this B natural, we're going to elide into a D flat 7 chord. So this B was the 5th of E7, but it's also the 7th of D flat 7. So we're going to continue up a D flat 7 chord and then resolve into our 1 chord. Let's take that back up to tempo. 2, 3, 4. Okay, this time over the 5 chord, let's go back and think B flat 7 to D flat 7 again. But this time we're going to think arpeggios from the thirds of those dominant chords. So over D minor 7, we're again thinking G7. And over the G7, we're going to go up an arpeggio on the third of B flat 7. And then an arpeggio on the third of D flat 7. And then we're going to resolve into our 1 chord. So if we look at the extensions that ends up making, is as we go up our G7, we've got the 5th, the 7th, the flat 9, the 4th, and then the 7th, the flat 9, the 3rd, and the flat 13th. But instead of having to add that up to some fancy scale or some fancy mode, we're just thinking about the chords that are in the family of 4 dominants and messing around moving back and forth between them. We can also play all of this vocabulary over minor 2-5-1s. So let's go to the relative minor. We were in C major, so the relative minor of C major is A minor, and the 2 chord in A minor is B minor 7 flat 5. So remember that B minor 7 flat 5 is the chord you get when you start on the 3rd of G7. So over this B minor 7 flat 5, we're going to think G7. Okay, so let's try playing over this minor 2-5-1. On the B minor 7 flat 5, we're going to think G7, and we're going to run that into the 5 chord, E7, and that's going to resolve into the 1 chord, A minor. So let's try playing that. So what did we just play? On B minor 7 flat 5, we came straight down a G7 scale. So we started on the root. So we put our half step between root and 7, and then walked down the scale. And then that connected into the 3rd of E7, where we put our rule where we got a half step between 3 and 2, and then 2 and 1, and then we just came right up our E7 arpeggio, and that resolved into A minor. Let's try it up to tempo. 2, 1, 2, 3. So now let's try using some of the siblings over this minor 2-5. We're going to start thinking G7 over the B half diminished, And then when it goes to the 5 chord, when it goes to E7, we're just going to continue to think G7 over that. And then we'll resolve into A minor. So let's see what that sounds like. Let's try speeding that up. 2, 3, 4. So let's take a closer look at what's going on there. Over B half diminished, we're coming up an arpeggio from the 5th of G7, and that resolves into the 3rd of G7. So we use our half step rule between 3 and 2, and then between 2 and 1. And then we're on E7, but we're still thinking G7 above it. So we use our half step rule between 1 and 7, and then just walk down the chord, or walk down the scale, get to the 3rd, jump up 1 chord tone, and then resolve into A minor. And then back up to speed. 2, 3, 4. This time, let's try thinking B flat 7 over the 5 chord. So on B minor 7 flat 5, we're still going to be thinking G7, but when it goes to the 5 chord, E7, now we're going to think about B flat 7 on top of that. And then that's going to resolve into the 1 chord, which is A minor. So let's see what that sounds like. Let's take a closer look at that. Over the B half diminished, we're starting on E natural, which is the 6th degree of our G7 scale. So we're just going to come down G7, put our rule between 2 and 1, and our rule between 1 and 7. But when we get to that 7, the chord changes to E7, and we're looking at this F as actually being the 5th of B flat 7. So let's go into a B flat 7 arpeggio. We go to the 3rd, we go to the root, let's come down, put our rule in between root and 7, jump up to the 5th, down to the 3rd, down to the root, and then that resolves into A minor 6. Let's hear that up to tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the last example we're going to look at today, and this is kind of similar to something we played in major, but now it's in a different context. So over B half diminished, we're still going to think G7, but when we go to E7, we're going to think B flat 7 to D flat 7, and then that's going to resolve into our 1 chord, A minor. So let's hear how that sounds. 2, 3, 4. So let's break that down. We're starting off from the 4th of G7, and then we put our rule between 2 and 1, and 1 and 7. And then when we get to E7, we're going to think up from the 3rd of B flat 7, and then up from the 3rd of D flat 7, which we would never ever think to play an E flat on an E7 chord, right? If we were coming from chord scale theory, but this E flat points up towards an E natural, and then we resolve into our A minor chord. So let's hear that one more time at tempo. Barry's theories are incredibly deep, and we just scratched the surface today, but I hope you can tell from just this brief introduction how valuable this information really is. Like I said, learning these concepts completely changed my playing overnight. Work on them, and I'll bet they can do the same for you. That's about it for this episode. Next time, I'll be looking at applying these concepts to playing on an actual tune. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take it easy.